house of passionate parents tonight in Cherokee County.
Right now, parents are lining up outside the Cobb County Board of Education.
An overflow crowd. Parents giving Forsyth County School Board members an earful.
Now to a heated debate in Brevard County over new guidelines for gay, lesbian, and transgender students.
Parents at an elite New York City private school outraged after high school juniors were asked to take a porn literacy course.
Fed up parents are fighting against their school's woke curriculum with mobile billboards.
Many people took part in a protest at the Santa Barbara County Courthouse.
Tense moments outside the Sarasota County Schools District headquarters. Moments before Tuesday night's board meeting.
This is where angry parents are accusing the school board of trying to indoctrinate students with controversial curriculum.
It was a packed house tonight at a school board meeting in Union County.
A marathon day today for the Palm Beach County Public School Board. The board heard
This is where angry parents are accusing the school board
over new guidelines for gay, lesbian, and transgender.
Welcome to FRC Action School Board Boot Camp. I'm Meg Kilgannon, Senior Fellow for Education Studies. Thank you for reporting for duty. Today we're going to learn how to file records requests at the state and local level to monitor what's happening in local schools. If you have friends who weren't able to join us today, they can find the information and our original School Board Boot Camp at www.frcaction.org/schools. This event is off the record and closed to the press. Members of the media should contact our communications office for more information. Our system of government is made up of checks and balances. We learned that in civics class. In a constitutional republic, we check power and balance power. An important check on governmental power is public accountability. Citizens who monitor the work of governing bodies play an important role in the system. Transparency is especially important when governmental work involves our nation's school children. We're pleased today to be joined by Bill Marshall, Senior Investigator for Judicial Watch. Bill has been an intelligence analyst and investigator in the government, private, and nonprofit sectors for approximately 35 years. He's a Senior Investigator for Judicial Watch, Inc. and contributor to Town Hall, American Thinker, Epoch Times, and The Federalist. Bill, we're grateful that you can join us today. How can our audience be more involved in monitoring what's happening in our nation's public schools?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Meg, for having me on today. It's wonderful, first of all, to be able to take part in this presentation. I think it's remarkable, honestly, what's happening in our country. And we're seeing this incredible transformation of our society and of our school system particularly. And it is vital that parents demand to know what their children are being taught. And I say that as the father of 3 grown children now. They all went through the Fairfax County, Virginia public school system. And they were indoctrinated. I will tell you, I know firsthand the indoctrination that happens, and I'll leave it there. My kids are great, and they're all productive members of society now. One's a high school physics teacher. I have a son who's an Army officer, and another daughter who's an intelligence analyst of sorts. But I think it's great that parents are taking charge in this effort and getting records, and I'd like to help them in that process a little bit. And what I've done is put together a little bit of a PowerPoint to give sort of the basics of FOIA. I've been doing FOIA investigations now for Judicial Watch for 8 years about, and I've been very fortunate to have done many of the stories that you see coming out of Judicial Watch, both as an investigator and a writer. And it's been terrific. The work that Judicial Watch, I'm very proud of the work we've done and the work that FRC is doing as well. Of course, we've been collaborating for many years as well, our 2 organizations. So this is just a great opportunity, and I hope that parents continue to press for information from their schools. Okay, first I'd like to present you with a quote. This was actually a quote by an NBC reporter. She made it in an interview, Brandy Zadrajny, about, I think it was back in June. And it was really remarkable to me. This is a member of the Fourth Estate who is supposed to hold power to account, right? They're supposed to challenge authority. And what she says here, and I'll just read this quickly, freedom of information laws are wonderful things, but it is in fact a tactic of national and fast-growing local organizations to use onerous public records requests. So what we'll see, what we saw in Maine, is asking for all these records requests of, how much money did you spend on anything involving race? And then that is used to sort of frame the school board as paying for CRT, which is, of course, critical race theory, which again is just not the case. Now, this is such an important interview. I'd like our producers, if they would, to actually show the minute and a half clip of this reporter. So I'm going to stop the screen share.
It's hard for me as a reporter because I don't want to put foils in a bad light, right? Freedom of information laws are wonderful things, but it is in fact a tactic of national and just hyper and fast-growing local organizations to use onerous public records requests. So what we'll see, what we saw in Maine, is asking for all of these records requests of, how much money did you spend on anything involving race? And then that is used to sort of frame, again, the school board as being, as paying for CRT, which again is just not the case. And so that's what happened there. In Nevada, we saw, again, this local group called Nevada Family Alliance, who was really known for trying to get drag queen story hour stopped at the local libraries. And now one activist there told me that this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. So she files these onerous FOIA requests, gets them, and then translates them in a way that's just not correct or accurate, in a way to suggest that, again, the school board is coming from your children and teachers are specifically teaching white kindergartners, that they're somehow oppressors. It's just not really true. So onerous FOIA requests, school board meetings showing up en masse and yelling at school board members, all of this is sort of a tactic, and it's being left up on by national organizations, from the Heritage Foundation to ALEC to other groups that have popped up after the Trump presidency to sort of push this American first agenda. And it's also being, roundly embraced by news organizations, like you mentioned, like Fox News, Breitbart, other right-wing organizations who are just covering this stuff en masse when it's really a local issue.
Again, this is just an amazing statement by this nitwit from NBC. Now, I'm a member of the media. I take the polar opposite view. Parents should absolutely be demanding that they be afforded the materials that are being used to indoctrinate their children. So let's move along here with our little show. Okay, basically there are three jurisdictions from which you can request records from government agencies. And there's of course a federal level, and those are governed under federal law by the Freedom of Information Act, which is 5 U.S. Code Section 552. The states each, and the District of Columbia, each have their own version of a freedom of information law. It's actually called the Freedom of Information Act in some jurisdictions like Virginia and Washington, D.C. New York has the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Law. In Pennsylvania, it's called the Right to Know Law. In Maryland, the Public Information Act. Florida, Sunshine Laws. Minnesota, Data Practices Act. Anyway, they all go by a slightly different name, but the elements are pretty much the same throughout. They're just differences in sort of technical issues. The counties and city agencies, including schools, fall under the state laws in which they're located, in the states in which they're located. Okay, so the essential elements of any FOIA request, whether it's going to be to a federal agency or to a local agency or school, are these. Okay, first you want to identify the agency which you think possesses the records that you want to obtain. That might be a school district, if it's, for example, a budget records related to a school district-wide program, like a diversity and equity inclusion office, I think. Or it could be directly to a school, to an elementary school or a middle school. And I'll show you some examples of that later that I have filed, or it might be to a state budget office. So you want to identify the agency that has records and determine the office to which the request should be sent. And there may be a designated FOIA officer or a specific FOIA office, or they may call it something else, a public records office. So you want to determine what those are. And oftentimes there'll be an individual that you can direct it to who is the designated FOIA officer. And you can usually find these out through the website of whatever agency it is. It might be someone who handles FOIA requests as sort of an ancillary duty, like a principal or some administrative officer. And they'll also generally give you directions of where to direct a public records request, whether, sometimes, and we've increasingly shifted, especially after COVID, almost all government agencies now handle their FOIA requests online, which is actually pretty helpful to me. It's much less cumbersome than having to submit a hard copy FOIA request in the mail, which I used to always do. The next element in the requests that you want to keep in mind is the legal statute you're using. So if you're sending a request to, for example, a Virginia school district, you might say something like, as a resident of Virginia, I request the following records pursuant to the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, section 2.2-3700, et cetera. And again, I will show some examples of these FOIA requests that I've actually sent, which where all these things are sort of denoted. The most important element of the request is the scope of the request, what we call the scope of the request. And that is the sort of the substance of what you're looking for. And in that, it's generally a paragraph long or maybe a few bulleted items, you'll specify the specific types of records that you're seeking. The more specific you can be, if, for example, you have the name of a document. For example, at the federal level, I often ask for SF-52s. That's standard form 52 of an employee. That might show, for example, bonuses that they've received or what their wages were of some government official that's is nefarious in some way, right? So we like to highlight what these people are being paid, for example. So that might be something you ask for, or all training records that were used to teach faculty about diversity and inclusion, implicit bias, these kinds of things. And I'll get into that a bit more with respect to the general issue of race, critical race theory and all of this. Another element that any records request will should contain is, generally speaking, almost always, is a time duration. You want to specify in both state and federal public records requests a time frame for them to conduct a search, because almost all of FOIA laws have a stipulation in there that the request be reasonable, and that means including in terms of time, that they have to search. Another element you should include is a fee waiver. Always request a fee waiver. The worst they can do is say no. But if you're requesting records now, as a member of the media, and we're also an educational foundation, Judicial Watch, we qualify, basically, we check two boxes to qualify for a fee waiver, and that says media and educational foundation. But if it's for non-commercial purposes, I would say that. If you're a parent, tell them that you want these records for the public interest, for non-commercial purposes. And as I said, the worst they can say is no. Also include your contact information, your phone number and email address. The email is primarily the way the government agencies like to communicate with people. It also memorializes things for you for litigation purposes later on, which I'll discuss. So again, the scope of the request is the most important element. And that boils down to what you want, right? The records that you want. I always advise people to research the issue first to see if the records are already out there, because if you're asking for them, there's a good possibility that someone else has also asked for them. And there are often records repositories. Like, for example, I've been requesting records lately related to the COVID vaccines from the COVID virus from the University of North Carolina. And they actually post all the records, public records that they furnished in response to records requests in some kind of repository. I forget the name of it, but they have like a web portal. So the FBI has something called the Vault, where they post all of their all the records that they release under FOIA. So that's something you might consider. Just look online to see if the record's already out there. I always suggest talking to experts in the field or insiders in the institution that you're asking for, you're seeking records from, because they can often provide the names of, for example, teachers that might be teaching a course that is outrageous in some way. They may be able to give you the names of documents or the names of courses, specific courses that you should ask about. And I've actually done that very recently. We'll be publishing another of my stories shortly on records I got from a Maryland school because a parent tipped me off to the name of a class. Another aspect of the scope is keeping requests manageable. I touched on this earlier about keeping it somewhat narrow in terms of time frame. Also, you don't want to get a lot of chaff. I mean, one of the biggest hurdles we face is that we'll sometimes be flooded with paper that we didn't really want. 99% of it will just be extraneous stuff. And that it'll be that 1% that'll be really newsworthy kind of material. And finally, I would just point out that agencies aren't obligated to create records. You never want to ask questions or pose questions in FOIA requests, because what the agency will come back and tell you is that they're not obligated to answer questions, because that would involve the creation of a record. You have to tell them what record you want, yet with some specificity. You can just say emails to and from, such and such official for the period, April to August 2021 regarding, and then specify a topic. You got to have some specificity about the records that you're looking for. So when it comes to all of this social justice and critical race theory stuff, what records might be of interest from schools? What I often ask for are course syllabi and outlines, teacher handouts, tests is something I sometimes ask for. Any surveys children are asked to, any documents that children are asked to fill out is good, because those can be shocking. Audiovisual presentations like PowerPoints, teachers' notes and lesson plans, lists of assigned texts. This is a good one, and this is particularly, you'll see, as I say in the story coming out about this Maryland school, some of the emails we got were very interesting between the principal and the teacher teaching one of these social justice type courses. Other records that might be of interest in this whole sort of era are budget records for diversity, equity, and inclusion office and programs. That's sort of a buzzword, I think, diversity, equity, and inclusion is, I think, how that these offices are often called. Policy documents for the creation and establishment of these offices. This is one I like. Contracts, agreements, purchase orders, financial disbursement records for third-party contractors providing services related to diversity training, critical race theory, racial equity. And you would be amazed at what people are, how many of these organizations there are that are offering these so-called diversity training classes, and what they are being paid with through your tax dollars. I would ask also for faculty and staff training materials related to diversity, equity, and or inclusivity training. I touched on emails before. Typically, in order for, and this applies to Freedom of Information Acts across the board at state and federal level, they generally have to be business related. It's the only way that an agency really is obligated to turn emails over, is if they relate to the business of that agency. And we see, particularly at the federal level, many emails that are just redacted because they are what we call B6, which means covered by personal privacy. Of course, those would surely be some of the most interesting, right? Because people are very sometimes candid in their opinions of political figures and so forth. But in any event, they'll generally withhold just purely personal emails. I often ask for emails sent to and from, whatever person I'm interested in, referencing, and these are the buzzwords that are being thrown around all the time in this big push to transform our society. social justice, white privilege, racial equity, Black Lives Matter. I include BLM, equity audit, cultural competency, implicit bias is another one. And there are others that you can learn just by looking at any probably Black Lives Matter document or website. Again, I say be reasonable on time duration, several weeks. I mean, you'd be amazed at what just a few emails, how scandalous just a few emails can be, 5 or 10 or 15, if they're, depending on what people are saying. People tend to be very candid in emails. We all are. We don't oftentimes give a whole lot of thought to what we're saying. But because these people are all public employees, their emails are official government records, official documents. So they are subject to FOIA. I generally won't exceed 2 years duration. Now, I did almost all the Judicial Watch work relating to Hillary Clinton and Huma Abedin, and that covered, we had something like 20,000 emails or something over years, many years, which interestingly were provided to us right in the run up to the 2016 election. The timing could not have been better for us. We got great stories out of those, but again, you don't want to be inundated with a whole lot of chaff. So I generally create a window around it. If it's a particular event on a particular day that I'm looking at, then I'll create like maybe a 1 week window on either side of that event to see what people were saying in emails. Now, after you file your FOIA request, agencies usually have sort of statutory deadlines they have to meet in responding. Now, that's going to vary at the state level. The federal level, it's 20 days, I believe, 20 business days. The states vary. I think Virginia, I want to say, is 3 or 10 or 5 days, maybe 7. New York, I believe, is 5 days. Some states are 10. Maryland is, I think, 30 days. A few states don't really have a set deadline. They just have this reasonable time frame. I think Florida might be one where they say, well, we must respond within a reasonable period of time, which is, of course, very subjective and gives an advantage to the agency. They'll often seek extensions, time extensions. The federal government is very big on that. Typically speaking, I will say this about FOIA, and that is that the bigger the agency, the more savvy they are in obstructing and obfuscating and just blocking you. Okay, so the federal government, particularly like the FBI and the DOJ, filled with lawyers, they are very good at playing semantic games and just using every tactic in the book to delay. But every federal agency is like that. DHS, HHS, all of these. The smaller the entity that you're looking at, typically, the more responsive they are in terms of time, and the more they furnish to you. Sometimes, to my mind, almost shockingly so. They'll provide stuff I never expected. I would have thought would have been blocked, under some exemption. So generally, schools are really, really good in school districts, entities to hit up for records, because they're not generally don't deal with a whole lot of FOIA requests. So they're intimidated by these things. Let me tell you, they are. And it's not just, requests coming from Judicial Watch, even from parents. Anytime especially when you cite the law in your FOIA request, that gets their attention. It does. Now, what they'll do is they'll send you typically a determination letter or determination email telling you, maybe that records are being provided, or they'll tell you that no records exist, or they'll tell you that records exist, but they're being denied based on some kind of exemption. Now, when that happens, okay, let's say you get records. Yippee, that's great. So the records arrive, but often they'll be heavily redacted based on various, exemptions. Typically, the exemptions cover things like personal privacy, law enforcement proceedings, or law enforcement techniques. That's why we find it very difficult, for example, to go after police records or involving the criminal matters that are still, being investigated. Now, I come from a law enforcement background many years ago, but I understand that. I understand the need to keep the integrity of an investigation, and I certainly don't quibble with that. The need to withhold information relating to ongoing law enforcement investigations. Unfortunately, what some police agencies will do is, even when a case is in all practical terms concluded, they will still claim it's still open just to prevent the release of records. Even if they've caught a suspect and prosecuted them, they'll still say that there's that the case is open. And I am not condemning law enforcement. That's not. I'm just saying occasionally that will happen. There's a little bit of gamesmanship sometimes. But I have a lot of respect for the rank and file law enforcement folks that they're working hard to keep us safe. Another big one, especially at the federal level, is what we call B5. That's the FOIA exemption B5, subsection B5, which covers deliberative process. And essentially, that means whenever two government officials are deliberating something, they're discussing some idea, some initiative, whether to proceed with it, how it should be framed, whatever. That's covered by this deliberative process exemption. Unfortunately, this thing is used like a tarp by the federal government. They throw the B5 exemption over so much stuff that it's really almost abusive. It's somewhat difficult for us to litigate against. That is to challenge in court successfully, but we do occasionally. And sometimes we'll ask the judge to review records in camera, behind in his chambers to determine whether or not something really meets the deliberative process standard. And sometimes it'll work. They'll find in our favor. Another exemption we sometimes see is what's called B4. This is proprietary commercial information. As an example of that, I got records. I don't know if you've seen the stories that Judicial Watch has been putting out on the fetal body parts, baby body parts. Now, it's actually my stories, my investigations, and in fact, Family Research Council, Chris Kasich over there gave me that idea years ago to go after these, and they've been tremendously good records in the sense of exposing a horrific practice of this is the NIH purchasing humanized mice. Okay, these are mice that have been injected or grafted with human tissue from aborted babies, where by a private company called Advanced Bioscience Resources, which was in turn buying the baby parts from like Planned Parenthood. Okay, now one can basically we saw records, we saw rates, prices redacted, I believe, in some of the records under B4. Not all of them. We actually got some pricing information, but that's the kind of thing where commercial information is being disclosed that can be withheld based on this exemption B4. If your records are denied, if you get no records, or if they redact part of the records that they do send you, you can file what's called an administrative appeal. It doesn't require a lawyer. You can just send an appeal, a very sort of generally worded letter saying that you receive the records and you respectfully repeal. I'm always nice in my correspondence. I'm always pleasant. These just FOIA people doing their job. Just saying you appeal the determination made and you request that the records be released forthwith or something. You generally have a set amount of time to file an administrative appeal after determination has been made. I think at the federal level, I think it's 90 days. I'm not sure if that's business days or calendar days, but it's like 90 days. And then the agency has a set deadline to respond to your appeal. And again, I think it's 20 business days. So you have to basically go through that whole administrative appeal process before you can bring. And then your appeal has to be denied, essentially. What they'll do is they'll say they're affirming their original, the appellate authority will say they're affirming their original denial. And at that point, you've played out the system. You've taken it as far as you can administratively. And at that point, a lawyer can step in and file a lawsuit. They can also, by the way, you can file a lawsuit if the government agency does not respond to your initial FOIA request within the 20 days. Okay, so if they don't meet that, if they don't send you a determination letter within the 20-day statutory turnaround time, that's also grounds for filing a lawsuit. And now I should point out, I'm not a lawyer. have graduate degrees and other things, but I'm not a lawyer. We do have, as you probably know, Judicial, which is a big staff of attorneys, and all they do is file FOIA litigation. They are real experts in this field. So some recent critical race theory type records requests that I've filed include ones against my son's alma mater, the West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, the U.S. Air Force Academy, the U.S. Naval Academy. They've all embraced this critical race theory stuff full tilt, and it's just shocking. Montgomery County Public Schools, two that I got records from that we'll discuss in a bit more detail, and we did some good stories on, or I did some good stories on, were Thomas Pyle Middle School and Greenwood Elementary. I filed requests with the Office of Secretary of Defense and a new Joe Biden created and Lloyd Austin created group within the Defense Department called the Countering Extremism Working Group, which is run by a guy named Bishop something or other. Anyway, he's a left-wing radical, I would say. And then I also filed one for the Virginia Department of Health, because they said that they were going to distribute the COVID vaccine based on the race of the individual, which seems to be a clear violation of the Constitution. So I mentioned the Thomas Pyle Middle School. That was a really good one because I got, based on a tip from a parent, I got some amazing social justice records from a social justice course, basically a critical race theory summer course that was being taught there, which just had some outrageous things like saying that if you use the term "Make America Great Again," then that's a sign that you're a covert white supremacist. Just amazing stuff. I also filed one against Montgomery County School System because I learned that they were conducting an anti-racism audit throughout their school system, and they spent $500,000 on this thing to some third-party contractor. And then, as I said, I've sent over the years many to West Point. They must hate me up there, but I asked for ones recently for communications among their top leadership. I mean, the superintendent, the commandant, and the top NCO, the sergeant major, regarding critical race theory, white supremacy, and all that kind of stuff. I also asked for PowerPoints used in training that reference critical race theory, white supremacy, things of that nature. Some interesting headlines I thought were interesting. There's a very interesting story some of you may have been following, involving this mom in Rhode Island, in South Kingstown, I think, Rhode Island, Nicole Solis, who is trying to get records related to critical race theory from her kid's school. The national, I think it was the National Education Association, one of the big teachers unions, actually sued the mother to stop her from getting these records. That's pretty amazing. One of the things that she had asked for, as I recall, were communications between like the school system and the teachers unions, by the way, which I've also asked for and gotten great records from. If you saw my story recently on the teachers unions communications with the CDC and the White House about masking kids in school and mandatory vaccines and all this craziness. Another headline involved actually one of my cases was a few years ago. I had gone after personnel records and communications of a Berkeley, California, far left-wing activist named Yvette Falarca, who was an official in a group called, I think it's By Any Means Necessary, one of these sort of Marxist-oriented groups. She actually sued us to stop us from getting these records. She sued her own school district, the Berkeley Unified School District, as well as Judicial Watch, and we fought her on that. And the judge wrote a scathing opinion in our favor and against Ms. Falarca and her attorneys, calling her case, among other things, entirely frivolous. I mean, it was one of the judges, as you know, are typically very tempered in their opinions, and this judge was obviously not happy with the case that was brought by Ms. Falarca. and we were awarded, I think, $27,000 legal fees, something. And then, as I mentioned, I did a story on this anti-racist audit thing where they spent a lot of money, and I actually have links. I won't bring up them now, but I actually have links in each of these. You could find them online. So that's what we do. Judicial Watch, we do our own journalism. We also help other nonprofits who are in sort of the same space philosophically as we are. We also provide both legal representation to individuals when their constitutional rights have been violated. Those can be those can be Fourth Amendment violations, First Amendment violations, as well as doing FOIA work on behalf of individuals. We have to be very selective, and we do that just because of the limited resources and manpower, both on our legal and investigative teams. We provide assistance to congressmen and their staff members if they approach us because they need information like everyone else, and they'll often come to us, as do occasionally foreign officials who are fighting some of the same fights we are. If, for example, you look at Macedonia dealing with the far left agenda of the Open Society Foundation that's being pushed over there, Albania, Guatemala, Colombia, countries that are traditionally pretty conservative, culturally, have been facing an onslaught from these sort of open society-backed groups, which, by the way, are collaborating heavily with the State Department, U.S. State Department, which my own reporting has shown. That's pretty much it. And that's my contact information. If you'd like to reach out, this is our website. And you can go to our press releases to see our stories. And we also publish quarterly, I think, a newsletter called The Verdict. And of course, Tom Fitton, my boss, does a lot of podcasts and so forth. And I think that should cover everything. I wanted to show examples of, maybe we can do that now, of some of these FOIA requests that I referenced earlier. So I'll end the screen sharing right here.
Bill, we have some really great questions for you. That was a fantastic presentation. The first question I have is, I think one that a lot of people here would like to know the answer to. If I file a request and they just acknowledge it, but they don't send anything back after 14 days, how do I get them to comply with the requirement? So if they're missing the time deadline, what is their recourse to enforcing it?
It depends on it. I don't know if it's a state request that they're sending, but they should look at whatever the state law is. If it's a state level request, just go online and look up the FOIA or the open records law, and it should specify in there how much time that the state has to respond. And at that point, they might consider consulting a lawyer. They could bounce a question off of us, and you can send it even to me, and I can direct it to our attorneys. We'll sometimes help people that file their own requests. We tend to prefer litigating our own requests simply because we have so much experience in in framing these requests. We know we can anticipate what how it's going to play out in court. Sure. So we like to use our own language.
We have a lot of other questions. If the agency is pushing back by wanting to ask the Attorney General's office for an exception, what are your options? What pertains to things that they will need to get an opinion about? If they offered an Attorney General opinion or redacted documents to streamline the response, how do you respond to that?
Well, that is to say, the agency that from whom the records were sought asked for the opinion of the Attorney General. That happens all the time in Texas for some reason. I don't know why that is, but whenever I send a request to Texas, they would always refer it to the Attorney General. Honestly, offhand, I don't know. I assume that I'm trying to think back, and I haven't done a request in Texas for a little while. I think that it's probably the same case where you just wait for the original agency that you submitted a request to. They have to respond, I believe, right. or maybe the Attorney General responds on the agency's behalf. But they have to provide some kind of a response to you. So then you just go off of that, whatever that response ultimately is, whether it's from the agency or from the Attorney General.
Sure. And I think some good advice, too, is that old saying, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. When you're dealing with these records requesting agencies and the FOIA officers, it's always best to start out very nice, right? Be
yes.
polite, respect people's time, do your own work, and don't assume the worst. People generally in these jobs are trying to do the best job they can.
That's exactly right. And they're often, honestly, I think they're often sympathetic to the FOIA requester. I mean, they can't really be partisan or take a side. They can't be advocates, as these FOIA officers. But I can tell you that there have been occasions where I've gotten more than I expected. Sometimes they'll provide me with records that I didn't exactly ask for, but they turned out to be better than what I had sought and, much more newsworthy. So, and I'm the same way. I tend to go maybe a little overboard on the politeness. But I think on two occasions where I felt I was dealing with an especially sort of obstreperous government agency or government officer, I was a little too maybe emotional or in a written reply or too snarky or something like that. And I regretted it both times afterward, because ultimately it's not going to help you in court. Right. Like if you take your case to a judge, he's not going to appreciate that you had an attitude, right? So it's always best to stay as even keeled as you can. Yeah.
I do have another question about FOIAs. This one just is specific to school boards, and then I have one related to a community college, and then I think we're going to call it a day. This question about school boards goes as follows. The superintendent and the vice chair were texting during the school board meeting, and we FOIA'd asking for the text messages, and they claimed that they were personal texts. Can we demand the text since they were two officials who were talking to each other in a public meeting?
Just because the conversation, my sense would be that just because the conversation occurred during an official meeting doesn't necessarily mean that the communications themselves were business related. It's a clever legal argument to make, but I doubt it's going to be successful. People text personal stuff all the time. It's going to be the content of the messages that matter. So and unfortunately, I will say this, we often, maybe it's just the nature of my work and having been an investigator, looking at some very bad people for many years. And I don't want to say I've become cynical, but I'm a bit skeptical at times that we're getting everything that we're entitled to get from government agencies. As I say, we know they incorrectly use B5, the deliberative process exemption a lot. I think that's fair to say. And I think Tom Fitton, I think he's addressed that in congressional hearings over the years when they've looked at revising these FOIA laws. That's one of the issues that come up. It's kind of based on the honor system, right? And I will tell you, when I worked in federal law enforcement on the intelligence side back in the 90s, I was very liberal in class. I was very liberal in the excessive sense of overclassifying documents. I think there's a tendency among the federal level to classify stuff that shouldn't be classified. And this has been an argument that's been, raging for a long time among government transparency advocates, is this overclassification issue. Now, this isn't going to be a problem really at this school with the school stuff, really. That's not a national security matter. I'm just saying sort of as an aside that we are very dependent, or largely dependent on the honor system when it comes to public records laws.
The audience member was asking about could he or she request the emails of a particular professor at a community college, all of the emails, and and we've had other questions about generally how much do these things, if you don't get your fee waived, how much can you expect to pay for some of these requests, and what would be too much, what would be reasonable?
To answer the first question, the generally open records laws require you to be reasonable, and I think the term of art is overly broad. You know, they'll say a request was overly broad if you don't specify a topic in emails that you're particularly interested in. Sometimes they'll even ask you to provide terms, search terms that they can use in conducting the search. So you can't. I don't think you can ask for all emails. Plus, what you end up with is getting so much extraneous stuff. Even if you did, even if you use search terms, you may end up. I mean, I'll tell you, I've been getting records from. Boy, I think I regret this, but I have requested records from a Snohomish, was it Washington, I think, or Oregon county councilwoman who tweeted a picture of a firebomb and talking about police. So she was, it appeared that she was an Antifa advocate. This is during all the rioting, right? She appeared to be endorsing Antifa and firebombing police officers. I thought that was pretty outrageous for an elected official, a county official. So I requested her emails regarding, I don't know, whatever it was, police or something. And I've been inundated with records from this. I mean, God bless them. They're trying to follow the letter of the law, and kind of, shame on me maybe for not narrowing the scope of my request. But I've just been every month, I get tons and tons of these things. So that's just sort of you don't know what you don't know. It's like as an investigator, whereas what was the famous quote from the former defense secretary, I think it's Donald Rumsfeld. He says, there are the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. Oftentimes with FOIA, there are the unknown unknowns. We don't really know what we're asking for or what we should be asking for. That's why it's very helpful to have an insider or an expert to kind of advise you, guide you. So that's a very long-winded answer to the first question, which is I don't think you can ask for a professor's entire email collection. That's just not reasonable. I would narrow the scope and offer some search terms. As far as fees go, what's reasonable? We've seen everything. I mean, I've been asked for tens of thousands of dollars for records, which I didn't think should require anywhere near that. Again, I'm speaking from the perspective of an organization that is both in the media and educational, sort of arenas. So we qualify for fee waiver exemptions. I don't know really what to tell a private citizen to seeking records other than to say that they are seeking the records for a non-commercial purpose. And if they have an outlet, like a media outlet, that they can publish the records in, to name that, would be my suggestion, to try to fall under a waiver to get a fee waiver.
Sure. So do you have, to wrap it up then, Bill, do you have a top 3 pieces of advice for the amateur FOIA requester, let's say, for the citizen activist who's wanting to seek information about what's going on the school board? Are there some basic, simple things that you want them to remember when they file that first request?
I would just say try to keep the request fairly straightforward and be somewhat specific in what you're looking for. As I said during the discussion on the scope, targeting, we call it targeting in FOIA. Be patient. FOIA is not, we were saying FOIA is not a friend of journalism. It takes so long. The records are often very old. By the time we get them, sometimes years go by. I sometimes joke that we're more historians than we are journalists because, it's like we're going back, trying to resurrect stuff from them that the others, maybe the many people would like the memory hole, right? So you have to be patient. And I would say be persistent. They will try, government agencies will try to deter you through delays and sort of obstruction, oftentimes, not always. I mean, like I say, there are many good FOIA officers who try to be we try to comply, but just be cognizant sort of the difficulties that they face, in terms of trying to fulfill these requests, and that they have to go through many records themselves, and then they have to read them line by line and redact information for legitimate reasons, for privacy reasons and others. So those three things, I would say try to be somewhat specific, be patient, and be persistent.
Great. And I'll add polite.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Bill. This has been fantastic. I know our audience has learned a lot. We really appreciate the time you spent with us today and appreciate your work at Judicial Watch generally. And just thank you so much for sharing your expertise. This has been
Well,
really
thank you.
valuable.
Again, thank you for the opportunity. And I applaud parents, and I encourage them, I beg them. Unlike Brandy's sort of draws me, I say go for it. Try to get the records out of the schools.
Great. Well, I think we have some folks who are going to be doing that. So
Terrific.
That will wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, Bill, for your time and this valuable tutorial on the records requests. We appreciate your work and your commitment to the cause. Bill's slides and some sample documents, along with a video of this event and the original School Board Boot Camp, will be available at www.frcaction.org/schools.